Shavua Tov. Welcome everyone. My name is Cantor Paul Bush, and I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of Rabbi Jonathan Kupitz and our senior staff, our Board of Trustees, and look forward to being part of this wonderful program along with all of you. Just wanted to mention a couple of points with our focus on safety and security. Please remember to silence your cell phones. Don't turn them off, but silence them, just in case you may need them for emergency purposes. And want to draw your attention to all of the exit points in our sanctuary and social hall. You will see the green exit signs all through the social hall area and the red exit signs through the sanctuary area. Please note that there's a direct exit to the exterior through the curtains there, should you need to evacuate in an emergency. We also have fire extinguishers and an AED in the area by the entrance there and down by the entrance to the social hall on the other side of the water fountain. There are also safety placards in your seat backs should you need to review any of these exit points. And should we have a need to evacuate, our gathering point will be at the other end of the parking lot by the beautiful new wall made of Jerusalem sandstone, so it looks anyways. Thank you, and without further ado, I just want to take a moment to once again thank the committee, to thank Shelley and Andrea and all of these wonderful volunteers that you see behind you. We have a wonderful reception plan after the presentation of Dan Grunfeld, and to tell you more about that, I want to introduce Andrea Tarr.
Thank you, Cantor Bush. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Welcome to our 24th annual Jewish Book Festival, sponsored by the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. I'm Andrea Tarr, co-chair of this event with co-chair Shelley Klein. Before we begin, please note where the exits are, as Cantor Paul has pointed out, and in case of emergency, here and there. Okay. It takes a tremendous amount of effort and commitment to create this festival. So before we begin our program, I'd like to acknowledge all the people involved. There's a lot of people involved. First, I would like to say a hearty thank you to Sally Loeb, Temple Administrator, to Cantor Paul Bush, TBI Board President Laura Zuckerman, Rabbi Kupitz, Board Member Candy Fisher, and Nathan Gibson, custodian, who have helped, each of them, helped in bringing this presentation forward. Thank you to our dedicated, devoted committee members. You're all around here. You can either raise your hand or stand up so we know who you are. Okay. And we also want to thank our advanced readers, the Federation staff, and our coordinator, Rebecca Russell. It's the Jewish Book Council in New York where we get our books from, so a big thank you to them, and our in-house tech wizard, Cantor Bush, and our behind-the-scenes tech wizard, Jake Tavel. We want to thank our Literary Circle members for whose financial support helped to make this entire festival possible, and members of the board of the Jewish Federation, Julie and Oran Resnick. Oran, thank you.
Good evening, I'm Oran Resnick, and a longtime member here at Temple Beth Israel and served on the Federation board. And I have to tell you, it's really nice to serve on the Federation board from my home temple, because I can't tell you how many times our home temple, as TBI is pointed out, as an example for other temples to follow. And one of those areas has to do with all the virtual things that have been going on and how we were ahead of it all. And now the rest of the temples, including PJTC in Pasadena, are asking for help on doing all this. So Cantor Bush and the rabbi been instrumental. As far as Federation stuff, you can go look online. I'm not going to give you some whole list of everything we do, but it's probably a lot more than you think. I'll just highlight PJ Library, which has been an absolute blow-up success, and that has brought 1,500 PJ Library kids in our community are getting Jewish books every month. And I will tell you, these are mostly 80% kids whose families are not affiliated with synagogues and have no Jewish connection otherwise, and this is their entry point. So it's great for the parents, it's great for the grandparents, and I think we just hit a milestone with our 5,000th book in the community. So that's been fantastic. And then let me just tell you about one event coming up in January, which is the Every Person Has a Name, Holocaust Remembrance. This too was something that we started doing, 5 years ago, and didn't get a lot of press, now gets a lot of press. We have over 200 readers. We basically, in a sense, sell out, there's no charge, of people to read for 25 straight hours the names of some of those who perished in the Holocaust. So with that, I'll leave you to the fun part of the evening, which of course is the book festival event. Take care. Shavua Tov.
Thank you, Arvan. Okay, thank you very much. This evening's program will be a presentation by our author, Dan Grunfeld, and we're going to follow this with a Q&A. And as the cantor reminded us, please, if you haven't already, you need to turn off or silence your cell phones. Save your questions, please, for after our author's presentation. And if you're watching virtually and have questions, just go to the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen and type in your questions at any time. If you wish to purchase this book or any of our festival books, those of you in the room will have an opportunity to purchase this book right here, and our author will gladly sign it for you. Those of you on Zoom will have an opportunity to purchase the book at any in-person book festival event, or visit the Federation office, or click the link in the chat. And now, before we get on too long here, let me present a little background on our author tonight, Dan Grunfeld. This evening, Mr. Grunfeld is our very special guest, and he is the acclaimed author of this book, By the Grace of the Game. As well as being a writer, Dan was a professional basketball player who also played college basketball. Dan was an academic, All-American, and All-Conference selection while he was at Stanford. Dan previously represented the U.S. in the Maccabee Games, helping to win in a dramatic final overtime against Israel. And many of you probably know of Dan's Romanian-born father, Ernie Grunfeld, who is a professional basketball legend. Ernie was an Olympic gold medalist. While at the University of Tennessee, he was drafted by the Milwaukee Bucks. However, Dan's book is not just a look at basketball. Dan includes the incredible, harrowing, real-life experiences that his grandparents endured while barely surviving life in Holocaust Romania. Dan includes details from their time living there until they were finally able to emigrate to the U.S. many years later. The countless trials, tribulations, and triumphs that his grandparents suffered will surely touch your heart and make you cry while filling you with a warm pride. And on a very personal note, I might add, you will fall in love with Dan's grandmother, Anu. So now please help me in welcoming our special guest, Dan Grunfeld.
Andrew, thank you so much, and thank you to the committee and Rebecca and everyone who supported this visit. It is great to be here with you today. I'd like to tell you a bit about my family story, so we'll take about 30, 35 minutes. and then, of course, would love to answer questions. And hopefully you'll grab a copy of the book and read the story more in depth. But again, so pleased to be with you here today. And for those joining on Zoom, thank you as well. That happens sometimes. I'm a bit on the tall side. Thank you. So as mentioned, my family's name has become synonymous with the game of basketball. And yes, I had a nice career at Stanford University and then professionally for almost a decade, but it's my dad who is one of the most prominent Jewish sports figures of all time. You know, his name is Ernie Grunfeld. He was a high school basketball All-American out of Queens, New York, a college basketball All-American at the University of Tennessee, and a longtime NBA player and executive. That has been very well known over time. What has not been well known until my book came out a year ago is that my dad is the only player in NBA history whose parents survived the Holocaust. I did a year and a half of research preparing to write my book, and that research suggests that my dad is the only athlete in the history of any of the major American sports leagues. So the NBA, the NFL, the NHL, or Major League Baseball, my dad is the only one whose parents are Holocaust survivors. Despite his great success as an athlete and some of the success I had, as was just mentioned, it's my grandmother who is the star of our family and the star of our story. You'll hear about her today, and hopefully you'll read the book and you'll really get to know her. You'll all be happy to learn she's 97 years old. She's living in the Bay Area. She's doing incredibly well. I will be visiting her tomorrow night. I talked to her this morning, and she said to me, "Tatala, I have to go. I'm cooking for you." And so I said, "Go. You have to go. You have to go." And when you read the book, you'll know I write a lot about her amazing Hungarian food and her cooking. But she is not only my hero, she is also a hero. And I'll tell you a little bit about her Holocaust survival story, and you'll understand why. So the story starts with her. She was born in Transylvania on the border of Romania and Hungary. I talk to a lot of groups of students about our family story, and I always ask them, "What do you know about Transylvania?" And they talk about Dracula and all these different things, and they don't actually know that is a real place, and that's where my grandparents were both born, and that's where my dad was born as well. So my grandmother is from a small village on the border of Romania and Hungary. She was born into an Orthodox Jewish family, 10 total siblings, and 2 loving parents. And I go to great lengths in my book to describe what life was like for my family before the Holocaust, because we know the numbers, right? We know 6 million Jews were killed and millions more, but those weren't just numbers. Those were people. And I appreciate so much what you just said about the reading of the names, right? Because we can never forget that these were human beings who were killed in the Holocaust. And so I describe life very vividly before the Nazis invaded. Now, I FaceTime with my grandmother every day. I have 2 young sons at home, and they're always running amok and being loud, and this is how young boys are. And my grandma says, "That's music for me," because that's what my house was, right? Filled with love, filled with laughter. They didn't have any technology. Of course, I mean, this was, way back when. They didn't have any running water. They didn't even have roads in her village, but they had a lot of love, and they had family. When the Nazis invaded, this was towards the end of the war, my grandmother happened to be visiting an older sister in Budapest. And so they got a letter from my great-grandfather, and all it said was, "Come home immediately." So they packed their belongings, they got ready to go to the train station. The following day, right before they were about to leave, they got another letter from my great-grandfather, and it said, "If you can, stay where you are." That's all it said. That was the last communication that my grandmother ever had with her beloved father. He was taken to Auschwitz, where he was killed. His name was Solomon Samuel. My oldest son's name is Solomon, after him. My grandmother still says it was that second letter that saved her from Auschwitz. So she had a chance to survive. She hid in bombed out buildings. She had to scrape and claw to get food. If you read my book, you'll learn that my grandmother has every quality one would need to survive an event like the Holocaust. She's smart, she's savvy, she's disciplined, she has tremendous will to live, but she also has great humility, because she'll be the first one to say, "You could have had all those things back then, and it didn't matter. You needed luck, and you needed help." And she had both those things. And in my book, you'll read about the soldier who gave her an extra piece of bread when she was starving in Budapest. Someone gave her a pair of pants to help keep her warm. Someone gave her a kiss on the cheek, which gave her hope. The most help my grandmother got was from Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Raoul Wallenberg, regarded as one of the greatest heroes of the Holocaust, credited for saving roughly 100,000 Jews in Budapest. And he saved my grandma's life twice during the war. And so the first way was Wallenberg went to Budapest and issued protective passports to Jews in Budapest. They were called Schutz passes. My grandmother was able to get a Schutz pass for herself, but she risked her life to obtain passes for 17 other people. So when I told you my grandmother's not only my hero, she's also a hero, it's the truth. Nazis were pulling Jews out of line at the embassy and taking them away, never to be seen again, and my grandmother kept going back time after time to get more passes. She got some for her sisters, for some friends she knew in the area, and just for some strangers who needed help. So that pass kept her safe for some time. Eventually, because of a change in government, it was no longer recognized. She was captured by the Nazis, and she was thrown in the Budapest ghetto. It was in the ghetto that she reunited with one of her brothers. Now, at this time, my grandma didn't know where the rest of her family was. She knew that most of her brothers were in labor camps, and one of her brothers had already been killed. But there was no information, so she didn't know where her family was. She was reunited with her brother, and they stayed together during the war in the ghetto. Nazis stayed out of the ghetto. They let Jews administer daily life. So one day, at the end of the war, my grandmother and her brother saw 20 Nazis enter the Budapest ghetto with machine guns over their shoulders. And word quickly spread that they were there to kill the remaining 80,000 Jews in the Budapest ghetto. So can you imagine an order to massacre 80,000 people? And so my grandmother and her brother, they raced up the stairs of the building that they were sleeping in. They found a small attic space, as my grandma describes it, room for 4 or 5 people to fit in comfortably. There were more than a dozen Jews packed in there fighting for their lives, and they waited for 10 minutes, and then 20 minutes, and then an hour, and nothing happened. And eventually they had someone go check, and the ghetto was clear. The Nazis had retreated. Soon after that, Russian and Romanian soldiers liberated the ghetto, and they were free to go home. That's how my grandma survived the Holocaust, and she never asked why the Nazis retreated that day, right? She was free, and that's what really mattered. And that was 1945, at the very end of the war. 40 years later, in 1985, my grandmother is living in the Bay Area. My dad is a big basketball star in the United States, and a movie was made about Raoul Wallenberg's life. Richard Chamberlain played the title character of Raoul Wallenberg, and it was in that movie that my grandma saw one of the final scenes of Wallenberg learning about the order to kill the Jews in the Budapest ghetto. He gets in his car, he races to the ghetto's gates, he confronts the general, and he tells the general, let these people go, they're innocent. And he said to the general, if you go through with this, I will personally make sure that you are hanged for this. And Wallenberg was able to convince the general to call off the massacre. And so it took my grandmother 40 years to learn that Raoul Wallenberg saved her life, not just once, but twice during the war. I speak to a lot of groups of students, as I mentioned, and I'll always tell them that heroes do look different and should look different. But if you Google the name Raoul Wallenberg, you will see the face of a true hero. He risked his life and ultimately lost his life to do what was right. He wasn't Jewish. He was just someone who stood up for the goodness of humanity, tried to help people, and helped so many people. And so he's always been a symbol in my family and will continue to be. I mean, he is the true definition of a hero. My grandma still sheds tears about Wallenberg. She says he did everything for us, and we couldn't do anything for him. And we were talking about Wallenberg a little earlier today, and I said there was a detail that I just learned 2 weeks ago from my grandmother that I wish I knew before the book, because I would have written it in there. I was at my grandmother's house in Northern California, and we were talking about Wallenberg, just, because we do once in a while. And she said to me, when he did all this for us, when he saved us, he was 32 years old. I couldn't believe that. In my head, he's the ultimate hero, right? But just a young man who again, gave his life to help others. So that's how my grandmother survived the Holocaust. When she got home to her rural village in Transylvania, her house was empty, completely looted. My great-grandfather was a landowner. He had crops and he had animals. Everything decimated, everything gone. My grandma would learn that 5 of her siblings and both of her parents were killed. At that time, my grandfather was in a forced labor camp in Hungary, and that's where he survived the war. He lost both of his parents and both of his sisters. So when he came home, he had nobody. A lot of people have asked me since my book has come out, okay, so your grandparents have this harrowing Holocaust survival story, and your dad is this big sports star in the United States, right? How do you connect these dots? And so, of course, it starts with my grandparents starting a family. And, you know, I did a year and a half of interviews preparing to write my book, and I asked my grandma, how do you go on, right? How do you possibly continue after all this loss and all this tragedy? And she said, you know, the human instinct is to rebuild. And that's what we did. You know, we got married and we started families. And so that's what my grandparents did. The day my grandmother got home from surviving, one of her older brothers had also survived a labor camp, and he was home. And all my grandma had to wear was a thin cotton dress, a raggedy blue overcoat, and some beat-up sneakers. That's what she was wearing through the frigid months in Budapest. And my great-uncle said, before we do anything, we need to get you some clothes, right? Because there was nothing in the house. He said, I made a good friend in our labor camp who's from this area. He opened up a small store that carries clothes. When we got home, let's go take you and get some clothes. And it was that day that my grandma walked through the doors of my grandfather's store. They met the day she got home. They married shortly thereafter, and my uncle was born. 8 years later, my dad came. And so my dad was born under communism in Romania. After, of course, surviving the Holocaust and all those horrors, my grandparents and family had to deal with communism. And my grandma still talks about that brutality. And the Romanians in particular were known for their brutality under communism. And so you couldn't say a word about the government. You couldn't have anything. You certainly couldn't have money, Romanian money or American dollars. And my family had both, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. When I was interviewing my dad for this book, I remember asking him, you know, what was it like to grow up so poor? He used an outhouse. They didn't have running water, right? He used to watch animals get slaughtered in the courtyard of their apartment complex, right? This is quite different than how I grew up. And in my book, I really juxtapose my upbringing with my ancestors because I was born into great privilege. And just to give you an example of that, my birth was literally planned around the NBA basketball schedule. Literally. My dad was playing for the New York Knicks, wearing number 18, right, which is the most symbolic number in Judaism. And I was delivered by C-section. My dad had 2 long road trips. And so my parents scheduled my birth, so that way my dad could go on 1 road trip, and he was there for my birth. Then he went on another road trip, and he was there for my bris. So it worked out really well. But that was how I came into the world, right? And I grew up with resources and opportunities and anything you could have asked for. Certainly my grandparents never had that luxury, but neither did my dad. And I asked him, what was it like to grow up so poor? And he didn't hesitate. He said, you know, I didn't grow up poor. Because to you it looks like I did because, you know something different, but I knew nothing different. There was no technology, there was no Twitter, right? He said I had a family, I had friends, and we had food on the table. He didn't realize that a lot of that food was black market meat because that's all you could get under communism, right? But he, by all accounts, had a happy childhood. But from my grandparents' perspective, extremely brutal. It took them a decade to get visas to leave Romania. And it was actually the state of Israel that agreed to pay for each Jewish family that the communists would allow to leave. By the way, and we'll touch on this a bit later, it took my dad 24 hours to become an American citizen because of his basketball ability. So that's how things can change over the generations. But so it took him 10 years. My family finally got visas to go to Israel. My grandfather wanted to go to the United States. He knew about the opportunity, the streets paved with gold. My grandma says, you know, I could say no to your grandfather. That was no problem, because she wanted to go to Israel. But my uncle had been dating a girl in Romania, and that girl had moved to the United States. And actually, unfortunately, she passed away 2 days ago, and I just learned that today as I'm now speaking about her, so may she rest in peace. But she was in the United States. And so my grandma said, well, I can say no to your grandfather, but not to your uncle. And so my family spent 6 months in Rome after leaving Romania, and I had to figure out a way to get to the United States. And it was the organization HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. There is a poster right out there, and I was very touched to see it walking in. It says, welcome the stranger, protect the refugee, I think and I write that in my book. It was HIAS that helped my family come to the United States. And so I mentioned a little bit about communism and about illegal money. And so I'll tell you one story from my book that I think you'll appreciate. You know, in order to have any type of life under communism, you had to transact on the black market, right? And it was illegal, but it wasn't shameful. So you have a job that's from a state-run store, and my grandfather was a salesman in a distressed material store. They just give you jobs, and you can't possess any money. But, you know, you maybe sell a little extra material and keep the rest for yourself. That's kind of how you can save up some money. Over 10 long, hard years, my grandparents had saved up $1,000 worth of Romanian money and 4,000 American dollars. They had friends who were jailed, tortured, and killed for even having money, right? You couldn't have it. My grandparents had chutzpah. They had saved up all this money. They actually hid it in a clock radio in their house. And my grandma tells a story of the communists bursting in one day, because that's what they did, and they just were searching for contraband. And a communist officer picked up the radio, and he said, "Where's the permit for this?" And my grandma said, "I don't have it." And he threw it on the ground, and they held their breath, and nothing came out, right? Because there was thousands of dollars of illegal money, which they would have been in big trouble. But so when they got visas to leave, they were not allowed to take anything of value with them out of the country. Nothing. But my grandparents said, we saved up all this money. We have to figure out a way to sneak this money out of Romania. And without spoiling anything, you'll still get the book. They got every cent of their money out, both the Romanian dollars and the American dollars. So I'll let you read about the plan for the Romanian dollars. It was something my grandfather came up with. Very daring, very gutsy. He executed it. They got their Romanian money out. The American dollars, there were much more of them, and it was much more dangerous. And they thought, how could we possibly smuggle this money out of communist Romania? My grandma said, well, okay, I have an idea. So my grandma had a cousin, also a Holocaust survivor, still alive in Budapest. He was working in Budapest on a movie set, and he was the translator and personal assistant for the movie's biggest star, a Jew from Brooklyn by the name of Buddy Hackett. And so my grandma said, well, if Buddy Hackett would agree to take our money back to New York and send it to my brother, and if we could get the money to him, maybe there's a chance. And so my cousin George asked Buddy Hackett, hey, my cousins are Holocaust survivors and they need help. Would you be willing to take their money back to the United States and send it to someone in the Bronx? And he said, if you can get me the money, consider it done. And so my grandmother sewed a false bottom into a suitcase. They had to figure out how to transport it. It was very dangerous, very clandestine. Again, you could read about it in the book. Eventually, the money hit Buddy Hackett's hands. It was no longer illegal. He took it back to the United States. He sent it to my great-uncle Andy in the Bronx with an extra $50 on top. And in today's money, that's more than $1,000. And that's also, you know, we know Buddy Hackett is a great comedian, but that's an act of kindness, you know, of people helping other people, of humanity. And so I love Buddy Hackett for what he did for my family. There was a note, handwritten from Buddy Hackett, and all it said was, good luck in America. Sincerely, Buddy Hackett. I wish my grandmother saved it. I feel like that. Do you have the note? I said, no, I wish I did. And that's the money that my family had to get started in the United States. What's amazing about this story, and sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, right? People always say, oh, it's so amazing. I say, I wish I would have made it up, because it means I'm so creative, right? But this is just how it happened. 15 or so years later, my grandparents had made good in the United States. My dad is this big basketball star, and my grandparents were vacationing in Las Vegas, and they saw Buddy Hackett perform, who, by the way, my grandma said it was so crude. The comedy was very crass. But she said at the end of the show, he talked about his son's bar mitzvah, and I really liked that. So my grandma was very dignified. After the show, they were eating dinner, and my grandma told the story. They had never met. This was from hundreds of miles away. He just did this for our family, and she told the story. And one of her friends excused himself from the table. He talked his way up to Buddy Hackett's hotel suite, and he told him, those Holocaust survivors you helped, they're here tonight. And he said, bring them up. And so my grandparents spent the night with Buddy Hackett in his hotel suite, drinking liquor, reminiscing. Buddy Hackett knew my dad. He's a Jewish player for the Knicks, right? So it was really the story coming full circle, and again, a tribute to what we're capable of, right? We saw the darkness of humanity with all my family went through, and the Holocaust with communism, but then you see the light, and then there is so much darkness in my family story, but there's much more light. And I think life is like that, right? We turn on the news and we see We see darkness and we see sorrow and we see pain, but there's always more light. And my family story is definitely a reflection of that. And so when my family arrived at JFK Airport in 1964, my dad was 9 years old. He spoke fluent Hungarian, Romanian, and Italian. He didn't speak a word of English, and he had never touched a basketball. So at this point, my family's already living the American dream. They have a chance to speak freely. My grandparents have a chance for their sons to get an education. They've never had these things before, right? So this is the American dream. And just to give you some context, I mentioned my uncle. What my dad called my uncle in their native language in Hungarian translates to English as my king. And I mentioned I have two little boys, right? You can imagine a little brother calling his big brother my king. So a few months after arriving in the United States, my uncle was diagnosed with leukemia, and he passed away within a year. So at 17 years old, my uncle passed away. I'm named after him. His name is Lutzi in Hungarian, but Leslie in English. My middle name is Leslie, and I'm very honest in the book about the obligation I feel. All the things that I've done, mentioned, I had success at Stanford on the basketball court in the classroom, and I'm proud of that, and I worked hard for that, but that has a lot to do with him. Knowing that there was a loved one who, was taken too soon, and of course, the family taken in the Holocaust as well plays into it, but certainly my uncle's passing is the biggest tragedy that my family had to deal with, right? For my grandparents to survive the Holocaust, but then to lose a son, for my dad to lose his hero and his brother, it's a hole that can't be filled. And so that's the situation that my dad found himself in, right? You could put yourself in his shoes. He's just turned 10 years old when his brother passed. Kids are making fun of him in New York City because he doesn't really speak English. He was uprooted from his homeland. My grandparents have to work 6 and 7 days a week to try to make a living. And so what my dad did was he went to the playgrounds in Queens, New York. And as he tells it, what kids did at the playgrounds is they played basketball. And he said, if you could play basketball in the neighborhood, that's how you made friends. And that's all he wanted. He just wanted something a community to belong to, and he wanted to make friends. And so I can say to him, well, you must have made a lot of friends. And sometimes things just click, and sometimes the stars align. And I don't think my dad would have flown so far so fast with basketball had he not been moving away from so much pain and tragedy. And so it didn't take long for my dad to be a good basketball player, and then one of the best players in the playground, and then one of the best players in the city. Again, I juxtapose my family's kind of past with my own, and from the time I was born, I wanted to be an NBA basketball player. That's what my dad did. That's all I thought about, right? And I put so much pressure on myself, and it drove me, but it also held me back at times, My dad had no such illusions. He wasn't, and I write in the book, for me, I had my eyes set on the peak of a mountain, and that's where I wanted to get. My dad, he just took one step at a time, and by the time he realized it, he was already at the top. And so I'll tell you a quick story from the book. My mom used to drive me to all my basketball games growing up. My dad used to work with me on my skills in my driveway. My sister was always supporting me. My grandparents, who were incredible, loving, doting parents, they didn't see my dad play basketball until he was a junior in high school. They knew he was doing it a lot. They had opened up a fabric store in the Bronx. They were working 6, 7 days a week. To this day, my grandma will tell me that she used to have to tell my grandfather, leave something for tomorrow, leave some work, right? They were building a life, and so they would just work. And they got a call at their fabric store. It was my dad's high school coach, and he said, Mrs. Grunfeld, you have to see your son play basketball. And the reason they hadn't been is because they would have had to close their fabric store to see one of his games because they were in the early afternoon. They could never close the store, right? This is how they made a living. And so the following week, they closed their store. They went to my dad's high school, but they didn't close it quite early enough. And when they got to the gym, the game had already started, and the gym was full. And so they got to the door, and the usher said, listen, game started. You're late. We can't let you in. Their English wasn't very good. My grandfather said, we're guests of coach. We're parents of player. So there's nothing I can do. You're late. The gym is full. And for whatever reason, my grandma said, our son's name is Ernie Grunfeld. She didn't even know what that meant. She just said it. And he said, why didn't you say that to begin with? And he opened the door, led them into the gym. And so this is their first time in a basketball gym, seeing my dad play. And they're looking around, and my grandfather nudges my grandma in Hungarian and says, well, if Ernie's such a good player, why isn't he on the court? And this time my grandmother grabbed him and said, Look right there. That's Ernie. He was standing right in the middle of the floor. My grandfather literally couldn't recognize my dad. And think about the symbolism, right? Like, he had transformed. He was an at-risk immigrant youth who had lost his brother, who was searching for belonging, and now he was on a basketball court. And my grandfather couldn't even recognize him. And my grandpa used to make my dad come to the fabric store every Saturday to work, which my dad didn't really love doing. And on the court after that game, he told my dad, "You never come to the store again. You take care of your basketball and we'll do the rest." The following year, my dad was an All-American. He was one of the most highly recruited players in the country. He went to the University of Tennessee, where he was a 4-time All-SEC player. He graduated as the school's all-time leading scorer and the second leading scorer in the history of the conference. This is the SEC, the best conference in the country for basketball. And that was 1977 when his career ended. To this day, he's the 5th leading scorer in the history of that conference. He was a good NBA basketball player. He was a phenomenon as a high school basketball player and a phenomenon as a college basketball player. As some of you know, he teamed with another great player in college named Bernard King, who would lead the NBA in scoring and was an NBA Hall of Famer, basketball Hall of Famer. They were called the Ernie and Bernie Show. They were on the cover of Sports Illustrated together. Bernard King is a black man from Brooklyn, New York. My dad is this white immigrant from Queens, New York. They went down to Knoxville, and they became one of the greatest duos in college basketball history. It's an amazing representation of what the game can do, because Bernard and my dad are from the same city, but they're from much different worlds. But the game brought them together. And they still talk on the phone every month. If you get a hardcover copy of my book, you'll see a quote from Bernard on the back. He texted me a few months ago to say, "Danny boy, I'm proud of you." You know, signed Uncle B, that's what I call him. They also played in the NBA together for the Knicks. So my dad has this incredible, legendary college career. When he's a sophomore at Tennessee, he had the chance to represent the United States in international competition. And so he, went to the team and he played, and on one of the last days of practice, the coach said, "Okay, we're going overseas now." They were going to Russia and Italy and Czechoslovakia at the time. So, "Okay, please bring your passports." My dad said, "Well, listen, I have a green card, but I don't have a passport." Coach said, "What? This is the USA team. What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, I'm not a citizen." And so they panicked, but then they did research, and because my dad had been in the country for 10 years, he was eligible for a passport. They were in Providence, Rhode Island. He flew to D.C. His papers were already filled out for him by someone at the embassy. 24 hours later, he returned back to Providence with his passport in his hand. So as I told you, 10 years in Romania to get visas, 24 hours to become a United States citizen. So he represented the United States in that competition. A year later, after my dad's junior year at Tennessee, when him and Bernard King were co-SEC Players of the Year, this is the same immigrant kid who came to the country 10 years prior, losing his brother, not speaking English. He had a chance to try for the United States Olympic team. And he made the Olympic team. And so this time, my grandparents closed their store for 2 weeks. They drove from Queens, New York to Montreal, Canada, and they got to see my dad stand on top of the Olympic podium and become a gold medalist for the United States of America. And so my book is called By the Grace of the Game. You can understand why I've called it that. The game of basketball was this incredible vehicle for my family, to take my dad away from all this tragedy, to give my grandparents this amazing life. And they had an amazing life anyway, from being an American and having a family to love. But to see my dad achieve these heights and this success, the game of basketball really did this. And so 11th pick in the NBA draft. My dad had a 9-year career and then was an NBA general manager for 30 years, including the president and general manager of the New York Knicks. And so when he came to the United States, when he came to New York City, he would take the subway from Queens, and my grandpa would take the subway from the Bronx. They'd meet at the old Madison Square Garden. They'd buy the cheapest tickets, because that's all they could afford, and they'd sit in the nosebleed sections and watch the Knicks. This is after my uncle passed. This is how my dad learned English, learned the language, watching the Knicks from the last row in the building. When I watched the Knicks at his age, I was sitting in a private skybox at Madison Square Garden because my dad ran the team. And so that's, again, what basketball did for our family. And so my dad is one of the longest tenured lead executives in NBA history. What's interesting is that his first job after retiring as a player, he was with the Knicks the last 4 years of his career, and they made him a broadcaster after he retired. So he was broadcasting Knicks games on the radio. When he arrived in the United States, my grandparents wanted him to go to a yeshiva in Queens, and they denied him admittance because he couldn't speak English. So he went to PS 101 in Queens, and it all worked out fine. But that same boy was then not only a New York City basketball legend and a Knicks legend, but he's now announcing games on the radio in English. And since he got to America when he was 9, he doesn't have an accent, but he still speaks fluent Hungarian, and I hear him and my grandmother talking to each other in Hungarian almost every day. And I write a lot in the book about Hungarian food, which is what my grandmother cooks for me, and Hungarian language, and it feels like home for me, hearing that language. And it's the theme of language it's very important to this story, right? Because basketball is a universal language, and there's always something we can connect on. So even if we don't speak the same language, which happens in this world, even if we actually can communicate in English, we might not be speaking the same language, but there's always common ground. There's always things to connect us. And so, again, my family story, it details some of the darkest moments in history, but it's ultimately hopeful, inspirational. I wanted to go to Stanford from the time I was in 6th grade because we were visiting colleges for my older sister. My grandmother lives 25 minutes from Stanford's campus. On a trip to see her, we saw Stanford. My sister liked it. I fell in love. Said, great basketball program, great school, 25 minutes from my grandma, I'm in. And I made it my dream to play at Stanford. And as I write in the book, that was a long shot for a slow Jewish kid from the suburbs, which is exactly what I was. And through a combination of luck, timing, skill, I got my scholarship to Stanford. That's where I played my college basketball. My grandmother came to every home game I played at Stanford. And if she were here right now, she'd say, and some road games, because she would come to Cal and USC and UCLA. By the way, every Sunday, she was at my dorm to stock my fridge, drop off my clean laundry, pick up my dirty laundry. Treated me very well. She even cleaned my roommates' rooms, my teammates. And I would tell her, I literally would say, Anu, let them clean their rooms. You clean my room, let them clean their room. She said, no. She calls me Tatala. If my Tatala lives here, it all has to be clean. So I said, clean their rooms, that's fine. But we spent these amazing years together. You'll read in my book, I suffered a very traumatic injury at Stanford when I was on the cusp of my dreams coming true and becoming an NBA player. I tore my ACL on national television with Tiger Woods sitting courtside. And I panicked, of course, rolling around on the floor. When I finally came to my senses, I realized my grandmother was kneeling down next to me, rubbing my head. And so she's always, been there through everything, and her example has really motivated me in all the things I've done in my life. And she's never been the type to say, I survived the Holocaust, right? You had a knee injury. Of course you can't compare those things. If she were here today, she would say, I don't want to talk about the injury, because she knows how hard it was for me. And so she's always given me space, to have my experiences, to mourn my disappointments, but she's also given me inspiration to pick myself up, keep working, and keep believing. And that's really what my family story is. So I'm so pleased to be able to share it with you today. Of course, I hope you pick up a copy for yourself or for someone you love and read it. And thank you so much for coming, and I'd love to just answer any questions you have. Thank you.
This isn't really a question, but I have a memory when your dad was playing at what I read, he would sink a basket. The announcer would say, the Tennessee announcer would say, that shot came straight from the land of milk and honey. Probably reference to his being Jewish. I remember reading that.
That's hilarious. Thank you for sharing that. So the Tennessee announcer, it was a guy named John Ward, a very famous announcer. And I actually didn't know that, but I'm going to ask my dad that, because that's great. They called my dad Ernie G, and he would always say, Ernie G, bottom. Because my dad was just a scoring machine, but I didn't know about the milk and honey reference. That's pretty good. I'll share something with you about my dad's time at Tennessee, which I learned. We were going to kind of like lock my book, right? I had written it, and it was proofread. And I was just still talking to people about the story, and I happened to connect with the manager of Tennessee when my dad was playing. And he told me, he goes, Dan, do you know what my job was after games when your dad was playing? I said, no, I have no idea. So, Tennessee Volunteers, they're bright orange. And so they would wear bright orange blazers. They're, very in your face, right? His job after a Tennessee road game is he would have to go up to the concourse in the opposing arena, find a payphone, call my grandparents collect in New York City to tell them how many points my dad had. And people would be throwing things at him, But he said, your grandparents were so committed to your dad's, they couldn't sleep unless they knew how did he play, how did they do. And so that's just, it's funny what you said about Milk and Honey. I'm going to confirm that with my dad, but I thought you'd enjoy that little tidbit because those were, by the way, there's an ESPN documentary series called 30 for 30, which many of you have probably seen. They made a 30 for 30 documentary about my dad and Bernard King. It's called Bernie and Ernie. It's an hour. Read my book first, but then watch the documentary. But it's a pretty amazing story because Bernard King became an NBA legend, and they were one of the best duos in college basketball history. It's a really great story.
We have a Zoom question. Why did your grandparents move to San Francisco from New York?
Absolutely. They lived in New York until the early 80s. My dad was now in the NBA, and actually the Knicks signed my dad in 1982, but my grandparents had already left, right? But my grandmother, who's 97 years old, as I mentioned, and I said there were 10, she had 9 siblings, so there were 10 of them. 5 were killed in the Holocaust, so 5 survived. She has outlived all of her siblings by more than 30 years. So that's her longevity. When she was in her 50s, she had a heart attack. And so they moved to the Bay Area to have a slower pace of life. Their best friends from Transylvania, one had survived Auschwitz, the other was in the working camp with my grandfather. They had moved to the Bay Area. And so my grandparents visited them. They said, nice climate, easy pace of life. This will be good for my grandmother's health. And I write this in the book. I asked my grandma, Anu, she's the picture of vitality. She plays bridge 4 times a week. By the way, she wins local bridge tournaments. I always tell people, you do want to eat her cooking, you do not want to play cards against her. Because she's also very serious about it. But I asked her, Anya, how do you have a heart attack as such a young woman? And she said, I lost a son. She said, you can't, the heart can't ever really heal from that. And so that's why they moved to the Bay Area. Yes, sir. Let's use the mic.
Has your grandmother ever given her testimonial or story to the USC Shoah Foundation or any other organization?
Yeah, she has. Shoah Foundation, there's also a Holocaust organization in the Bay Area where she's made her tapes, and that's really important. And so through my book, and I was mentioning this earlier, when I talk to students, I ask them, how many of you have met a Holocaust survivor? And very few hands go up. So for me, I tell them, read my book and you'll know one, which is true. You'll get to know my grandma through this book, but not everyone has a grandchild who's going to write a book, and seeing it and hearing it, and even hearing my grandma's accent, it matters. And so it was always very important to us to make sure that that stuff was documented. Thank you.
I mentioned this to Dan earlier. I was introduced to the book by my son Jesse, who is currently a coach at Stanford. And Jesse said that they bought a book for everybody on the team, and then they had a Zoom conference with Mr. Grunfeld. And I just want you to know, I just so admire the fact that you used your book as a lesson with these college students about your journey, about perseverance, about the value and respect of everybody's journey. I think that's great.
Ms. Pruitt, thank you so much. Jesse is a very good friend of mine, was a very good college basketball player as well, and he was instrumental in that. We worked together and purchased books for the team. I talked to them, and he arranged everything, and it was very, very meaningful. It was, and so I just thank you for raising a great son who helped me get that done.
Well, I just wanted to point out, Wallenberg was not Jewish. However, he did have some distant connection. I've read this before, and I just checked it to be sure. He was 1/16 Jewish. He had a great-great-grandfather, and he was always aware of this growing up. It was not something that was hidden from him, and he apparently connected with it even when he was young.
Okay, good to know. Thank you for that. He also, he studied at the University of Michigan. I recently spoke, to a group in Ann Arbor, and they were all saying, Wallenberg, there's a little statue of him on campus, and so, just an amazing person, really amazing, someone I admire so much.
Yeah, hi. So I'm curious, everything sounds wonderful, and it was, but I'm curious because of the times we're living in now, did your dad experience anti-Semitism during his time at Tennessee, or before or after? NBA?
So you can't be Jewish anywhere in the world and not experience anti-Semitism somewhere. On the basketball court, no. And when we talked about it, many people have asked, and he always says at Tennessee, because Bernard King experienced racism, and he talks about it in the documentary pretty vividly. My dad says, if it were going on, I didn't notice, or it just wasn't something that, that affected me. But he says that no, he didn't experience it. And I did have one teammate who told a Jewish joke, and that is anti-Semitism, right? So I often say I didn't experience anti-Semitism as an athlete. Well, I had a teammate who told a Jewish joke, and that is anti-Semitism. But aside from that incident, I didn't experience anti-Semitism on the basketball floor, and that's like the best version of what we hope sports are. A safe space, a connector. And unfortunately, in the world of sports now, we've been dealing with the themes of anti-Semitism, which has been very upsetting for me, and I've done podcasts about it and talked on radio about it, because any time that stereotypes are messaged to a lot of people, it's so dangerous and it's so destructive. And people talk about, is this athlete anti-Semitic, or is this person anti-Semitic? I'm less concerned with what one person thinks and much more concerned with what millions of people are exposed to, and especially impressionable young people. And so these are super important themes, but for me as an athlete, I didn't, and neither did my dad. And so we hope that's the best part of sports. We got Rebecca back there.
Keep it all the same. I get 2 mics. You mentioned that your dream to play basketball in the way that you wanted to was cut short. I know all of us have dreams and goals we strive for, and then our life changes and we find new dreams and goals. I wanted to know if you were able to attain your other dreams and goals in life, how that changed, where your life trajectory went, because obviously you're in a beautiful place. I've heard you talk about your family, your kids, and this book that you've written is pretty phenomenal. So I wanted to know if you had other dreams sort of take that place, and what your original dream had to end and how that changed your trajectory.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Listen, when you're young, you set goals, you want to achieve things. It's really about fulfillment. And I found fulfillment in life that far surpasses what I could have ever imagined as being an NBA basketball player, right? Because I have a beautiful family, I have children, I have a wife who I love. That's what's much more important, right? So your whole perspective changes on things. I will say that I always grew up thinking about the NBA. And I played 8 years as a professional basketball player in very top leagues. And I write in the book, I asked my mom when I was playing in Europe and doing well, I said, do you think I'm kind of doing what I always wanted to do? She didn't hesitate. She said, absolutely. You're just doing it in a different place. And so your concept of what your dream is as a youngster, it can take different forms. And honestly, even if I never played basketball at that level, I gave it my all. I learned so much. I worked at it. And then things evolve. And yes, my dream then became to tell this story. And this means a lot more than, honestly, than my basketball career does, because this is the story of my grandparents surviving the Holocaust. So yeah, dreams, goals, ambitions, they're really good. They motivate you. You should always set them, but they're fluid. Thank you.
Well, I have one question for you before we wrap up, and it's probably one you've been hearing before. I'm just curious how your publisher reacted when you proposed the idea of your father, the basketball legend, and your career with the Holocaust roots of your family origin, all that. I'm wondering how that went to the publisher.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that. So I never proposed that to a publisher. But there's backstory to it. So how this would usually work for a book like this is you'd have an idea. So, okay, I have a family story. You'd put a proposal together. You would get an agent. That agent would then kind of sell the proposal to a publisher. Then you'd write the book. For me, I was getting my MBA at Stanford, and I was working with an English professor, kind of incubating this idea. And he told me, this is how you would do this. but this is not how I think you should do this. And so the advice he gave me was, write the book. Just write it. Don't ask anyone if they think you should or how they should do it, because he knew I could write and he knew how much the story meant to me. And so he just said, write your book and then figure it out. And that's what I did. I wrote the book, I got an agent, and then we just said, so it wasn't an idea, it was like, here's a story, and so they got to read the story. And then once they read it, they could understand it. I will tell you that I talked to the first literary agent I talked to was skeptical, very skeptical, and I actually had a personal relationship with her. And she said, I remember she said to me, well, a lot of people have family who have survived the Holocaust, and a lot of people have parents, like a dad who was played in the NBA. And I said, that's fair, just objectively, my dad is the only person in the history of the world to have done both. But I said that, I said, that's what makes the story interesting, but that's fine. And I'll tell you, this literary agent reviewed the project, and she wrote me an email, and she said, you know, there's no story here. She said, I have the email. Believe me, I have the email. And I've been thinking, what should I do with it? And if you read the book, you'll see I'm an intense person. It's good to have some motivation. And she said, there's no story here. Your grandmother would really appreciate you writing this and then publishing it for her. But yeah, that was it. It was very dismissive of the story. I'll let you in on something else. Filmmakers have approached us, and we're making a documentary now. And so I'll be filming with my grandmother on Monday and Tuesday. So thank you so much. And I've been on Good Morning America talking about this book. Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley were on TNT talking about this story. That's all great, and I'm proud of that. But it really shows you, and it relates to the story. Don't let anyone tell you you can't, right? No one believed in my dad. People were making fun of him. So I really kind of take that to heart, where everyone's an overnight success story 15 years in the making. And for me, I just had people tell me, there's nothing here. I said, okay, well, I'm going to give it a shot, and we'll see. Thank you for that question. I told you it was a good answer.
Thank you tonight, Dan, for that terrific presentation. We all just love this. Don't forget to get your copy of this book. Dan will be happy to sign it for you, and any of the books that we have in our festival here. We appreciate you sharing all these experiences from the book, and we surely enjoyed meeting you in person. And before we begin, we have a little raffle. Before we begin our raffle, I'd like to ask Dan to select this evening's winning person.
You can't make this up, okay? Deborah Pruitt. Just listen, it was meant to be, okay?
Okay, so we have the raffle prize up here for the person, Deborah. Here we go.
All of these?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, okay.
And thank you, Dan, for selecting this evening's winner. Thank you, Dan. We look forward to seeing you next time. And before you all go enjoy books and refreshments, let me just remind you of our upcoming events very quickly. The Jewish Book Festival events that are coming, 7:30 on December 3rd at Monrovia Library, we're presenting Lana Melman, who wrote a book called Artists Under Fire, BDS, War Against Celebrities, Jews, and Israel. That's December 3rd at 7:30, Monrovia Library. The very next day, we're honored to present our new program, One Book, One Community. And our selection by an author named Jai Chakrabarty is a book called A Play for the End of the World. This event at Temple Sinai in Glendale will be at 4 p.m. and, of course, on Zoom. And finally, we have David Seapress, author and cartoonist, who will present his book, What's So Funny, on December 10th. There's an $18 fee for the dessert reception, and that will be 7:30 p.m. at the Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center. And those are all the programs. Make sure you find a copy of the book that Dan wrote. You'll love it. And thank you very much, everybody, for attending this evening. And we'll see you later. Thank you.